Especially for those 3 people who are online watching this on web stream. Welcome to Playing for Keeps, Gameful Design for Real-World Action and Social Change. My name is Gene Koo. I am an independent consultant who works with organizations on using video games for advancing their social mission. And let me just give you a quick overview of how this session is going to work for those of you who want to know how everything rolls out and what the timing is going to be. We're going to, of course, as always, introduce ourselves and what we do. And then the reason why we've asked all of you to move on up to the front is we're going to do a short game that actually is going to illustrate some of the things we're going to be talking about. So it's important that people participate because it actually is going to be something we will discuss. Then we'll move on to some case studies from all of our experiences using games for real-world impact, and then get into questions both across the panel and with you. And with such an intimate group, I think we can have a much more lively and engaging conversation than you usually can at these kinds of conferences. So we're looking forward to having a good chat with all of you. So why don't we just actually go on down the line and have, starting with Scott to my left, introduce yourselves. And actually, I've asked everyone to not only say who you are, but throw out your working definition of what you mean when you use the word game.
My name is Scot Osterweil. I'm the creative director of the MIT Education Arcade and of our not-for-profit spin-off, the Learning Games Network. I've made a lot of games over about 20 years. And I hew to a fairly conservative view of games. I sort of go with Eric Zimmerman and Katie Salen. That, games are a pretty formal thing with a set of goals, clear rules, and kinds of feedback that give you measures of your own success within that game. Having said that I think when you call something a game, it better be a game, I also think that learning happens in ways that are not, games are only a part of the learning that happens. And so I'm also interested in, the fact that I've given that definition of games doesn't mean that I'm not interested in other things that are close to or similar to games, but not games. So there's reasons to call the game a game, but there's also reasons to look at things that aren't games. So.
And Eric, can I assume that you came up with this panel?
I did come up with this
Okay,
panel.
so maybe when you introduce yourself, you can also tell us what you mean by gameful.
Sure. So the first thing I did when I came up with this
introduce
panel
yourself
is to request a comically large room, and
Yeah, right, exactly.
I got that. So my mission is complete. So my name is Eric Gordon, and I am an associate professor at Emerson College and the director of the Engagement Game Lab there at Emerson, and I'm also a fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard, where I study games games that facilitate, motivate, create civic engagements. And so let me first get to the question of my definition of a game, and I'll just throw this out, and it's something that I hope to be able to complicate a little bit as we talk. But to me, a game is a system that is fundamentally and necessarily playable. So I'm just going to stick with that for a moment and see where that goes, and maybe there'll be some discussion about that definition. But and finally, to your question about what I meant by gameful, it's a word that is certainly I didn't make up. It's a word that's been used by all sorts of people, including Jane McGonigal, to talk about a particular approach to the design of playful experiences, essentially. And often it's been used as a way of distinguishing from other kinds of game design within this space, which would be a kind of gamification. So I actually used it as a way to differentiate what I think all of us will be talking about from other discourses of gamification.
Thank you. And then Pablo, after Pablo introduces himself, just so you can brace yourselves for this, Pablo is going to be our leader in the introductory game. And for those of you who have just come in, I encourage you to move on up because this is a very participatory workshop, and there will be a game that you will be engaged in.
And if you're in the back, you can't win the dinette set.
Thanks. Hi, folks. My name is Pablo Suarez. There was a time when I was a math geek growing up in Argentina, became a researcher on climate and disasters, and evolved into a humanitarian worker. I now am Associate Director for Research and Innovation at the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. My team helps both humanitarian workers and government and other organizations and people at risk, subsistence farmers, shantytown dwellers, fishing communities, to understand what's going on with the climate, what we know about it. Can be tomorrow's hurricane or El Nino causing drought or climate change, and what can we do about it? I used to be very, very talented in my work at putting people to sleep. Imagine explaining climate science to a humanitarian worker who has hungry people that need to be fed, homeless people that need to be sheltered, sick people that need to be healed. And explaining science was boring, so I bumped into games as a way to explain complexity. And while I embrace Salin and Zimmerman and so on, I'm going to take the liberty of come up with a definition of games that works for what I do. Games are rule-based machines that engender insight and emotion. And with that said, let's see if I can play a game with you. This is a game that was played in the White House. I was offered 5 minutes. I begged for 2 more, and I got 7. And this is how it went. Let's see if it worked similarly. Hello, my name, actually, now you count the 10 minutes, right? And you stop me when time comes up. Hello, my name is Pablo. I used to be a researcher on climate and disasters. I'm now a humanitarian worker, but I am not a humanitarian worker now. I have just become the global atmospheric system. And this is not a frisbee, it's a hurricane, okay? You guys are not who you really are. You are disaster managers from the Red Cross in an archipelago country, like could be Philippines or many of the places in the Caribbean. Please stand up, everybody, including those who are not in the front. So here's the rules of the game. This is a hurricane. If it hits you, it's bad. Okay? That's in the fiction of the game. It's foam. It doesn't really hurt. Now, I am going to throw this according to some rules determined by the global atmospheric circulation system. You may not know those rules, but the rules exist. They have to do with this pair of dice. I'm going to throw the dice, look at it, process, and throw it in some direction. If it goes your way and it hits you, it's bad. Now, as Red Cross disaster manager, you can take action before the hurricane hits. And how do you do that? By ducking, right? Ducking means taking action for disaster preparedness. So if the frisbee is coming this way, awesome. Good Red Cross worker. Now, if you do that and the frisbee goes over there, what happens? She ducked in vain. She acted in vain, evacuation in vain, prepositioning tents and medicine in vain. That's bad. It erodes trust, and more importantly, it gets people to no longer want to work with you. So, round 1, we're going to play a few rounds until you get it. What's the purpose? For you individually to not be hit, and for you collectively to figure out the rule of the system so that sooner than he tells me time's up, there's a moment when the frisbee, the hurricane, flies elegantly through the room. Okay? And I'm going to do what I do, you do what you do. Oh. Bad news number 1. We got an accident. You guys can talk to each other. You're all Red Cross, huh? You have no choice but be who you are. All right, my bad throw. Can I get your help? Thank you. The only reason why no one was hurt is because the hurricane went to a wrong place uninhabited. There was no preparedness there.
So I'm assuming this is 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 like a clock?
Oh, bad.
Yeah, 7, 9, 9 o'clock. We should shout out what it is. 11.
Another case of savior unpopulated system. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm not good at playing frisbee, unfortunately.
Can we help?
Nice!
Whoa.
Right? So she ducked as the hurricane was beginning to go her way. Now here comes the real test. What she did was, in the real world, what my colleagues do is to say, run, it's coming! And there's no time to do more than that. Your birth certificate, it's gone, because you didn't have the time to go for it. You have 2 more tries. Awesome, I love it. So it's a 10, what should happen? Right. Oh. What happened was that, okay, let's pause here. And after this one. You have to act as soon as you can.
2.
Right. Just in case she's ducking. Not fully, though. These guys are staying standing. What do you think should happen in this room? Who should move? Everyone? These guys. Who? Well, yeah, she for sure. She's risk averse. As you could tell, some of you, the rule is double 1, throw over there, double 6, throw over there. Okay? Now, what happened, and I want to end before time is up. What happened in the White House, 130 people, is that they got it that it was linking knowledge with action faster than you did. So when finally they got the rule, which you got much faster than they did, by the way, they started testing. Here, nobody ever sat down except for one person. You guys are, yeah, I don't know about those hurricane things, right? Whereas if you're a disaster manager, you're tempted to act in vain until you figure out what's the right balance on when to act in vain and when you fail to act, which means people suffer, okay? Importantly, when I rolled a 4 and a 6, it was a 10. I meant to throw it to him, but it went that way. And this happens in the real world. Scientists can see stuff about the atmosphere, and they can predict something's going that way, but they will get it somewhat wrong some of the time. So what happened in these 7 minutes or so? You all have some level of heartbeat that is different from what it was when you were sitting, right? Factor number 1. That heartbeat pumps oxygen to the brain, you're more engaged. You got something about being a Red Cross worker. Here, lots of disasters, you failed to act. My colleagues think Katrina, think Hurricane Sandy, think typhoon in the Philippines, super typhoon, 2 months ago. Think all the time when science says, watch out, our numbers tell us that something big is brewing and is roughly going that way, and yet we don't act enough. In this game, it is my hope that you understood that a little bit of knowledge can help someone, our hero of the day, I would argue, duck before it happens, which in the real world means actions that we don't really know what they are, but at a minimum should be run to a safe place. So was there emotion? Was there insight? I don't know, but that was the intent. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you, Pablo. And for the record, that was 7 minutes.
Good, as intended.
Very good. Well, and I hope that we'll be able to kind of reference back to that experience you just had as we go through our conversation today. What I think ties together all the different presentations we're about to go through and then the conversation we have is this kind of big question. I think a lot of the conference here, a lot of the conversations here have been about kind of learning and kind of a lot of the questions there about transferability and all that kind of stuff, but learning, whether in a K-12 environment or college or an informal environment. I think the conversation we're going to have here is going to shift that a little bit more towards the kind of the figuring out, as you all did very quickly, okay, well, what did this dice say, you know, the cognitive part, to the how do we get people to actually duck, which, you know, and I think it's an interesting question even in this room, why did that game work or not work in terms of creating an action? So a lot of the conversation we want to have today is about how do the games encourage action with or without the learning. I think learning is clearly a part of that. So with that kind of frame, I want to first turn it over to Eric, and I believe you're still planning on talking about Community Planet. No.
Yeah, I'll say a little bit about that.
Okay,
yeah,
very good.
And I'll show a video.
Very good.
So thanks, Gene. So so I'm just going to talk for a few minutes of the format. We're each going to talk very briefly and then open it up for a conversation between us and with you. And I just want to say a few things generally about the approach to games, and what I think are some of the fundamental issues facing game design in this space. So let me first define what I mean by this space. And sorry if it's a little awkward, but I have my notes on my computer, so I'm going to have to look over here, as I did not plan for this room. So all of us here on the panel, I don't want to speak for everybody exactly, but I will say that the commonality is that we're designing games for some sort of purpose, whether that's learning, capacity building, or civic action. There's some purpose outside of the system of the game that we're trying to achieve. We're trying to reach some goal we're trying to reach. So, for instance, in the games that I design and in our lab, we're looking at games that, again, motivate some kind of civic learning and subsequently civic action. So some understanding of the sort of public context in which people act, and then some actual understanding or even facilitation of those actions outside. And so what's interesting about that is that these are two parallel and sometimes conflicting goals. We have the goals of the game, and we have the goals outside of the game. And I promised Gene that I wouldn't use any jargon, but I'm going to for a second. Just to quote the philosopher Bernard Suits, who talks about the distinction between, well, actually he talks about what he calls pre-illusory goals. So what goals do we have before we enter into a game? So in chess, we know that the pre-illusory goal in that game is that we want to immobilize our opponent's king. That's our goal. We understand that fairly well. We're able to frame that. When we design a game that is supposed to achieve a purpose outside of that, then we have a bit of a conflict between what Suits calls the pre-illusory goal and what I'll call for a second the extra-illusory goal. What is that goal outside of the game? So there is the goal of the player, when the player, either before the player enters into the game or while the player is in the game. And then there are these other goals, these learning goals, these civic goals, these action-taking goals that we want to achieve. And I see that as a really interesting kind of tension space. So we take a game like, I don't know, some of you might be familiar with a game called Spent, which is this online game that it's really about budget planning, but ultimately it's about understanding poverty and the condition of being in poverty. And it's a game that doesn't take very long to play. It's a pretty quick game. But just to use that as an example, I think there's an interesting contradiction there, or rather tension, between the extra-illusory goal, which is getting the player to understand the condition of poverty in some way, and then even taking action once the game is over to make a difference in the world, and then the goal of the game, which the goal of the game for the player is to play the game well. The goal of the game for the player is to balance their budget. So they're not thinking that I'm playing this game because I want to learn about poverty. They're actually playing the game because they want to balance their budget. And that, again, that's the tension that I think is so unique within the context of game design. So here's the unique challenge. We want to make a player experience. We want the player to experience what is outside the game, even take action outside the game, but we need for the player to voluntarily play the game for an entirely different reason. So there's the challenge. So what does that mean for the context of game design? And it's very, very different, I want to say, than designing other kinds of activities or other kinds of processes. So when we design a non-game platform, for instance, we also find comedy between the goal of the system and the goal of the user. That we want the user to interact with that thing because they're trying to achieve some sort of goal, and they'll use the system, and those things will run in parallel, and everybody will be happy. So, for instance, if we were making a website about poverty reduction, it would be designed around the user's motivation to learn more about poverty reduction. But in a game where the act of playing necessitates a set of rules apart from the rules of everyday life, the player behaves very differently than the user. The player wants to play a game, regardless if she comes to it on her own or a teacher tells her to come to it. She's motivated by the act of playing a game, and a good game design actually enhances that sense of motivation. So here lies the challenge: designing games for social impact. for finding the points of convergence between the illusory and the extra-illusory. So the game is social impact only when the player makes a conscious or unconscious connection between the two without sacrificing the integrity of the game. So what is that moment when the player understands, like, aha, I'm playing this game, even though I was playing it to play the game, I'm playing this game and I learned about poverty. I learned about something else. I'm even better equipped to take some sort of action in the world. So too often, I think, and this is something I hope we could talk about, organizations seeking to use games resort to gamification as a means of motivating very specific and predefined behaviors. So this is what I was saying before about even the definition of this panel, is I really want to get at that distinction, is that often gamification is about adding game mechanics in order to enhance or make more efficient certain behaviors. But it's not necessarily doing what I was just talking about, which is creating the conditions for play that often lead to very different kinds of learning outcomes. And so I do a lot of work. Well, I work with the Red Cross, and Pablo is not necessarily an example, not at all an example of what I'm talking about. But I think a lot of organizations come to games because they think about games as being efficient systems that will lead to certain behavior change, and not necessarily thinking about games as actually, again, as Bernard Suit says, fundamentally inefficient systems. Because we enter into games, when we play in a game, we enter into it not to get to our goal, but to get to our goal with the barriers that are put in front of us, or the obstacles that are put in front of us. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about a specific example, and do I have a few minutes left?
You do, yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about a game that we made, and I want to talk about a specific iteration of this game. It's a game called Community Planet that we've used in a number of different contexts. This was designed at the Engagement Game Lab. It was designed specifically to facilitate public processes around some sort of policy planning. So it's been used in the context of urban planning in Detroit and Philadelphia. It's been used in the context of education planning in education policy planning in Boston and Los Angeles. It's been used for environmental impact planning on Cape Cod, as an example. It's been used in a bunch of different contexts around large policy decisions that had to be made by a lot of people, or with input from a lot of people, rather, and to design a way that kind of process can be played in and played with. So the game is a 3-week process. Usually the game runs, and the goal of the game is to actually fund these causes. So there's money at stake as the goal of the game. At the end of the game, some causes get funded that people actually have to rally support for within the game itself, and players actually compete against one another, but also collaborate with one another in order to get causes funded within the game. So what I want to show you is a video of a recent project that we're about to launch, actually. And I think this is a kind of an interesting example, and one that will resonate with with both what Scott and Pablo will talk about. But this game was a game that we launched, or about to launch rather, in the Republic of Moldova, which is a small country next to Ukraine. And the game is about, we were asked to do this game in partnership with the United Nations Development Program, specifically to get at the policy issue of youth unemployment. So we're about to launch this game that is geared towards youth across within the country of Moldova. We started the game process by facilitating a 2-day workshop with youth leaders from throughout the country that came together to actually think about what it means to play with these very serious ideas, but then ultimately to create content that went into the game. So here, let me show you a video. This is a promotional video that we made specifically about this project, and that is, well, yeah. Let's hope it plays.
They need it. They're going to switch the screen.
Oh, yeah, just pause until they can switch it.
Yeah. Can we
Sorry,
switch the screen?
Can we switch the screen to the laptop?
Here comes the help.
It's kind of like walking down the aisle at the wedding.
Yeah.
Is there something I can do here to facilitate that?
Technology, guys.
It's connected to the Mac right now. Sorry, everyone. maybe I don't.
Yeah, we saw some change
Something's
happening.
flipped. Yeah. He went back.
All right. Well, I'll give you a second to do that. Well, that's a real buzzkill. I mean, one of the things we try to do with games is to make things a little bit more engaging. So let me say, if we don't get that up outside of the video, you can imagine it. And outside of the video, I just want to say that some of the questions that I'm concerned with, and hopefully we'll talk about. Oh, look at that. Can you hit play?
Full screen that sucker. There we go.
That's it.
Thank you. Okay, so just a few last words about this. Some of the questions I have about a process like this is to what extent, now you think about this is the game that is being sponsored by the UN, where people will hear about this from that entity. So the entity essentially of the UN will market this to people as a thing to play. And the question I have is, to what extent is trust a background to play in something like this, where what people do in the game is actually going to affect policy? Will the lack of trust in the extra-illusory outcomes, basically, determine willingness to play? So there's absolutely no trust in government. And that's very similar to, well, I would say it's similar but very different to the context in the United States, and we could talk a bit more about that if we have time. So again, the game is sponsored, in this case, by the UN and not the government, and it was a very explicit decision to not have the government on it at all, because of that level of mistrust that's there. So I guess the larger question is, to what extent does trust actually impact people's willingness to play? Also within this context, there's the particularities of a post-Soviet democratic context, and to what extent does that undermine assumptions about participatory and deliberative democracy that are built into a system like this, the values that were built into this system before it is played in this context. And then I guess the deeper question is, can a game facilitate play with democracy as opposed to simply play towards democracy? In other words, can a game lay bare the underlying grammar of democracy in ways that are productive and not destructive? And so these are some of the larger questions, and I'll leave you with one more, is the dimension of trust that relates to the sponsoring organization's trust in a game. So to what extent is the fact that the UN is sponsoring a game to be played to facilitate feedback on particular policy issues, to what extent does that actually indicate a trust in the illusory goals of the game, a trust in the sense that people will, a trust in that people will play towards, or rather play with a system as opposed to playing towards. They're not just seeking the extra illusory goals, they're actually looking for something else. I don't know that they know what they're looking for, but I think that's an interesting tension. So it's not simply about masking true intent in this case. It's in fact shifting intent. So shifting intent of the sponsoring organization and the players to accommodate play. And that's where I'll leave it.
Well, Eric, before we go on to the Pablo's presentation, I have to ask, because I think there's probably people in the audience who are wondering this. Can you please describe what the actual game is? I don't know if you can do this succinctly, but what is the play that people are going to be doing?
So the play is that it's a series of challenges that lead you're confronted with a series of challenges and barriers to achieving your goal, which is finishing a mission, essentially. And that mission is about a particular theme that's related to the thing that people are talking about. So in youth unemployment, we're going to be talking about access to education, for example. And people are kind of taken through this sort of scaffolded process of doing these challenges, which is finding, whether it's creating images or mapping things or simply answering questions. People are doing that and then being challenged all the while by these characters called technocrats that are trying to test you in your knowledge as you sort of proceed or progress in the mission. And then ultimately what you're doing is you're collecting coins that you then harness with other players to fund causes. So the goal of the game is to gather as many coins as possible, but then ultimately you have to collaborate with other people in order to get causes.
So there's a knowledge accumulation part of the game where you're supposed to learn about some subject matter, and then you're being tested by these technocrats on that. But there's also a deliberative aspect in which people are engaging with each other both in real space and virtually?
That's right. So there's a deliberative aspect, and exactly, they're deliberating online with each other, and actually, within the system, there are all sorts of prompts to do that. But then we also have game finale meetings that invite people at the end of the game to actually play with the data that gets produced in the game.
And that conversation is part of the game. It's not external to the game. It is the game.
Well, it's that moment where we try to conflate the illusory and extra illusory. Okay. That's that moment where we actually sort of take it to the. It's like debriefing. If you've done games before, it's an important part of that learning.
The equivalent of the question of is it on the final is do you get coins for it?
Yes, I guess.
I thought that would be a yes/no answer, but
yeah.
No, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Are we all set technically?
Yeah.
Over
Well,
here? So thank you, Eric.
I come from the non-digital world,
So I think if you hit play, it'll automatically show up on the screen.
If I know how to push the buttons, oops.
If you hit you have yours up?
It's about getting this
Is
window.
yours a video or also?
Yeah.
Okay, then
come
you
on.
need to drag it into
Yeah,
the...
I'm trying to drag it to the side and it's not doing as I want. See, this is what happens when you bring a non-digital guy to a digital conference. I did as you told me, but I'm not doing it. Oh, it's that one, not that other one. Right, all right. Thank goodness there's those who know.
Just double click the handle on it.
So I'm going to give you a flavor of the games that we have been designing with my team, the Red Cross, Red Crescent, Climate Center, and partners.
From Boston University,
Can we silence
where
it?
we engage
Sorry.
with students and researchers.
This is copy-pasted from other videos. You don't want to hear my voice twice.
Wait, you wanted to keep playing but silenced? No?
We're just muting it,
Okay.
or we can pull the thing. All right.
There we go.
Okay. So the first game you saw was actually a series of games played at Boston University with students, researchers, and others. A large number of games, all the way from games about mosquito. It's like a rock, paper, scissors mechanic where if you're a mosquito, you're trying to bite people or to lay eggs. And if you're a human, you're trying to protect from biting or eliminate the breeding grounds. And this helps very quickly to learn some core mechanics about what you can and cannot do and what are the best collective approaches to deal with the threat, which is of course related to climate because warmer conditions are favorable to mosquitoes. This other one is a game in Moropoto, Nicaragua, where there's two communities, one upstream, one downstream. The ones upstream don't have fertile ground, or chopping the forest to make money and survive. In doing so, they are causing more flood downstream where people have good land, but now their crops are constantly failing. So you can see how there is decision, the board essentially mimics the upstream and downstream conditions. And the game was played by folks from the two communities, talking to each other, and in playing the game, they realized that maybe those downstream could provide incentives to those upstream to not chop the trees so they don't get flooded, but they have to give them something in exchange and so on. We're trying to facilitate both learning and dialogue. The next one is in Kazungula, Zambia. Our friend Steve from the end, from the double one of the arc, was there along with one of Eric's students, Wade. And this is a game where you see people with a cup of water, passing water from upstream to downstream, and the more water is in the cup as determined by a roll of the die, the more chances of a flood downstream, and people at the end in Kazungula have to make decisions about whether or not to do this or that. And this game is in the process of becoming digital, but instead of having cups, it's about the real river level as observed by players. And they send the message via SMS, and then people start by themselves collecting information about how the river behaves, collecting understanding about what happens here will translate into something that happens later elsewhere, and then working with the Red Cross, the Zambia Red Cross, and partners in improving the formulation and implementation of early warning systems. This is how excited people can get when they get it right. This is from Kenya, the village of Matu, where we had a game on gender and climate. In this place, 98% of the land is owned by male farmers. This, I guess you can recognize that dude. And this is from the session in the White House with 130 people ducking for their lives. And again, it was 7 minutes. And in those 7 minutes, imagine how much one could convey in 7 minutes about the importance of climate science to help make smarter decisions to save lives. Now, when you play a game and you see that the numbers are in front of you and you're not ducking, isn't it a bit more inviting to think about action? And when you complement the game with a real-world invitation to do something differently, it is more likely to work. Now comes the next part of my digital. Can we open the PowerPoint? Now it's not detecting my fingers, folks. So it's not detecting his fingers either. There we go. Nice. So I want to show you just a couple of slides. Yeah, thanks. This one is some of the organizations with which we have creative games, including Stanford University, Oxfam America, MIT, the World Bank, 6 teams within the World Bank. The chief economist for sustainable development of the World Bank and her team have concocted this nuanced and very important concept they refer to as deep uncertainty. And they're trying to communicate it to people that are investing billions of dollars in things that are supposed to last, but they get wiped out by floods or ruined by droughts. And they have not successfully communicated that. They have invited a Red Cross team. Okay? World Bank economists invite Red Cross folks who know how to design games to help World Bank communicate difficult concepts to Ministry of Finance of Indonesia, Peru, and other places. And it's working. It's working because people make decisions, and in making those decisions, they realize that the information they have, like that, is somewhat obfuscating the fact that we don't know what we don't know. There is uncertainty, and if you make decisions thinking that you know, then surprises may come. If you know you don't know, then you prepare for more of a range of plausible outcomes. What do you do once you know what you know and you don't know? You're supposed to take action differently. This is from Namibia, a game designed in collaboration with our colleagues from Parsons, New School for Design, the Pet Lab team, Colleen McLean and her students. And this was about community members taking action before a flood. And those things are becoming embedded in our disaster preparedness programs. Now, what I want to offer to you is that I'm a system dynamics modeler by training. When people speak of games as systems, I understand. When you talk about learning, I can see the complexity that wants to be communicated. But what I care about is if there's something knowable about the future, if there's a crystal ball that can tell us something about the future, and that something is science, and you are the Red Cross, and you want to make decisions so that when the future comes, people don't suffer. When the future comes, you make smarter decisions. How can you do something smart? Games are the only way that I have found to take a challenge, either in terms of learning, because some people don't understand nuanced concepts, or in terms of dialogue, because the expert from the meteorological agency is talking jargonish gibberish to a disaster manager or to a subsistence farmer, and there is no conversation. We put them in a place under the same roof and they play a game and they understand what the other one knows and doesn't. They develop a common language and they like interacting with each other. They create a bond that otherwise would never develop. On the contrary, there will be hatred at the end of it, because the expert says, go get a PhD in atmospheric science and then we talk, and the person from the real world says, who do these people think they are? We are finding that games enable learning, enable dialogue, and more importantly, create an appetite for asking the right questions and trying to turn the knowledge emerging from answering those questions, turn that knowledge into action with the right partners. We're getting into a more complex world where we can no longer do things as we used to. It's getting more complicated. The climate is changing, urbanization, environmental change, all sorts of things. Doing the usual things won't work. How can we work with others? In our experience, games can help. I love what you said about trust. I don't understand how it works, but games are a magical way to engender trust once gameplay is ongoing. In the beginning, there's a lot of the opposite of trust. When I show up and say, okay, everyone stand up, and this is a hurricane, people are like, who's this dude? What am I doing here? Can I run away? And some do. But if they stay, then the conversation that emerges can be more fruitful, and we are finding that Oxford University, the World Bank, UN World Food Program, many others want to work with us more, not just because of the extended presence of the Red Cross, but also because our methodology of game-enabled learning and dialogue can help them accomplish what they want to accomplish. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Pablo. Gonna go from here
Yeah.
to you.
I have another. I have a different. Yep. It's that one. Yep. Conveniently, just as I got up to talk, this popped out of my belt, so I'll try to get it back on, but waiting. Yeah, that's the one. Having to play. And I've also, I tend to improvise a lot, and so I've already decided to go in a different order than my my original slide. So this is the left. Okay, these. Okay. So so anyway, I want to talk about. We talk about games for learning. I don't think we often really interrogate what we mean by learning, and that's sort of what I want to talk about. And you're all really smart by virtue of the fact that you came to this session, so you probably don't have the wrong definition of learning, but I find more often than not when I talk to people and we talk about learning, what you discover when you sort of dig underneath the hood is that people's model of learning is there's something in my brain and I tell it and then it's in your brain and you've learned it. And that's a faulty model, of course, and it gets propagated in games in which people think of games as carriers of content. So I filled this game up with content, you play the game, now the content moves into your brain. That's not how it works. We all learn by constructing knowledge, and what games really do are give us tools with which to construct knowledge. But you knew that. But I want to talk about 3 ways that I know of that games do that. And I'm just going to, the pictures are really just examples of stuff we've done. One thing that games are really good for is preparation for future learning. What I would argue is that frequently games give us a chance to play with concepts, with ideas, to slowly build up mental models, what I'd like to think of as scaffolding, so that when we actually do engage with real content, that instead of that content sort of going right by us, we start hooking it up. We start wiring it in our brain in our own individual ways because we have the scaffolding, and the game is what provides the scaffolding. So just to use an example, a game that we collaborated with, the D2D Fund is a foundation that works to improve financial literacy amongst the most underserved parts of the population. So here was a game that plays a lot like Farmville. You're trying to run a farm, but along the way, if you take out a loan, you get rabbits, and the rabbits begin to multiply. And the longer the game goes, the more they multiply. On the other hand, if you invest in trees, trees grow very slowly, but toward the end of the game, they start yielding fruit. Now, nowhere in the game do we call that interest, either the rabbits or the trees. But in fact, what we're really doing is building up the model in people's minds of what compounding really looks like. And we have, and just to talk about how that works, how it really worked in the real world, we have the experience of testing this in a school. We did a little, we didn't do it, but D2D Fund did a trial sort of where they had some kids get the standard lecture that they always get on financial literacy before they played the game. And as typically happens, because the lecturer is used to this, they're leaning back, they're bored, they're not paying any attention, they don't really want to listen to an adult tell them about financial literacy. The second group played the game, then got the lecture, and they peppered the lecturer with questions he'd never gotten from students before. It was a completely different experience. So the game wasn't teaching them in any kind of formal, literal sense about finances. Finances never get mentioned in a formal way, but we were building up a scaffolding for that. So that's one purpose, preparation for future learning. Let's see if I can go back. Oops. I don't know what to do in here. Oh, it's that one. Sorry, it's not my computer. So another game we did with D2D, another thing that games I think are really powerful for is efficacy. In a game, we take a challenge on and we overcome it. And in that process, the reason we enjoy playing games is because we enjoy the experience of overcoming challenges. As Eric mentioned, frequently they may even be unnecessary challenges. There may be easier ways to get to our goal than this game provides. Just quickly use golf as an example. It's much easier to walk over to the end of the course and drop the ball in the hole with your bare hands than it is to use the long club and try to hit. But we like that challenge. We rise to that challenge. So in this game, and my point about it is, and so using that sense of mastery and efficacy in a game can be very powerful. In this example, this was a game for people to just encourage them to not use credit card debt or payday loans as a way of sort of managing their finances. Now, we went into that on the assumption you could write that down on a 3x5 card and everyone could carry it in their wallet. Don't build credit card debt. Don't use a payday loan. It wouldn't do any good. It wouldn't do any good because people feel powerless in that setting. And so what we really wanted to do was change their sense of themselves. And so we had a game where they play as the manager for a spendthrift celebrity. And as the manager, they take over and they master their finances. They basically help the celebrity get on track. And so we were sort of offloading the responsibility for the bad decision making on the celebrity and letting you play as the responsible party, smarter than that celebrity. And in fact, it sort of had the effect of making people feel that maybe they could get control of their own finances. One other quick example of efficacy in a game, I'm skipping all around here. A language game that we're in the middle of developing, and we're using it for ESL. It's called Xenos. We tested it last spring with working immigrants in the US, Spanish-speaking immigrants. This game does not do what you think language games would do. This does not drill on vocabulary. This doesn't test them on their content knowledge. It gives them a chance in a playful way to use the language they have, to use it strategically, to use it inventively. We are continually exposing them to new language, but their efforts in the game are all about playing the game and sensing themselves as someone who can gradually master language. And so we saw results on two fronts. First of all, their actual language learning as measured in standardized tests improved in 10 weeks of gameplay, equivalent to 12 weeks to a year of classroom instruction. So without any instruction, their sort of testable language skills improved. But more importantly to me, their sense of their ability to use language improved. Something like 98% reported that they felt more comfortable using English in their workplace, with their kids at school. So we were changing their attitude toward their own abilities. So I'm going to sort of take off of that to talk about the last thing that we did. We had another game that was sort of designed to do a similar thing around science. It was called Vanished. It was an online game. It was for middle schoolers. They signed up in 2011 to play the MIT Smithsonian science game. We did it with the Smithsonian. On day one, they got there to play the game. The game was set to launch on a certain day, and 3,000 kids logged in on launch date. And there was this video of MIT students who said, well, we had this game all planned, but somebody hacked our server, and the server's down. We can't figure out what to do. We need your help solving this challenge. That led the kids down a rabbit hole of an 8-week-long series of scientific investigations, which they all participated with online. Our goal there was the same efficacy goal, was to improve, get their sense that the kinds of things that they do as game players also is what scientists do, to change their sort of identity with science, to get them to realize that they could be scientists. And we did see that result. We did see that result. But there was another thing that we did, and this is the third point I wanted to make, which is that, and this is why, although I started with a very conservative definition of games, this really wasn't a game in the end. It didn't have all the formal features of a game. It had a really engrossing narrative, and they projected themselves into that narrative. And so, so it seems to me that the third thing that games and game-like things can do, and as I said, I don't think things have to all be games, is really invite a kind of imaginative projection into a space to change people's imagination about what's possible. And in that process, to change their sense of what action is possible. And so I think that particularly when we're talking about games for social good, getting people to imagine that there are solutions, to actually maybe use, and this is really coming back to what I think both of you are doing, is to imaginatively project themselves into a problem-solving space. And then those are totally illusory goals, but of course then, like Eric, I have the hope that they become extra illusory goals. So that's enough about
Thank you,
our
Scott.
stuff.
So I'm actually hearing these different themes emerge, and I'm going to invite you to critique or reject what I'm about to say, but what I'm hearing is kind of three different kinds of impact that games could have. The first is the one that I think a lot of us tend to talk about most of, which is the kind of cognitive learning, whether it's about how does a system work, what does the dice mean when I roll a 2, where is the frisbee going to go? 12 is going to go here, 2 is going to go there. We figured out the system, and that has something to do with the real system in the world. The second I'm hearing, which is very interesting, is some kind of affective outcome, whether it's building up your idea that I have efficacy or that I actually like you. You know, we're from different parts of an organization or competing organizations, but actually we've now created a new space where we can get along, and so that's not the same thing as learning about what this other person does, but feeling differently either about yourself or somebody else. And then the third, which I'm surprised we didn't talk more about, and I'm curious about it, is actual action. And I think I saw a little hint of that with the I'm going to say the wrong name again, Upriver.
Yeah, you got it right.
Where, and it was a quick slide where the villagers were using the water to, and that was the cognitive, they were using water to pour down, to simulate the idea of a flood going down a river, and then more and more water would kind of go down the system until finally there would be a flood. And that was the cognitive, how does and if I understand this correctly from when Eric explained to me, this was trying to get actually two things. Cognitively understand how flooding works, and then secondly, effectively actually understanding that it's actually feeling like it's predictable rather than it's just an act of God or something like that. I hope I'm not putting words in your mouth there. But then the third thing that is going on there that you suggested, and I am curious about this, is you mentioned that there's going to be a mobile version of this, and that not just that the mobile version is not going to be oriented at learning about how the system works, but rather is going to become the actual early warning system for flooding, which is just in a completely different space than learning about how the floods are going to come, but rather this game becomes a way in which villagers will start warning each other that the waters are rising and you should prepare yourselves. Is that, I mean, just let me confirm that that's actually,
yeah,
so in that case, then the goal is actually a change in behavior and a change in the system itself rather than learning about the system. Just wanted to kind of, those are three things that I heard that I want to kind of put into boxes that you can then deconstruct. But is that about right in terms of what I heard the three of you discussing? And I'm looking at you, Pablo, because I guess you had mentioned that particular game.
Yeah, and to me what is most relevant is that, again, I feel like I'm an imposter here. This is a digital media learning event, and I don't know how to show a PowerPoint. But I am here because the power of digital technology to amplify and accelerate not only how information flows and how it's processed, but also to inspire, to motivate people to want to acquire that information and to want to help others make sense of that information is what I really hope we can create by fusing you guys, the researchers, the developers, the doers, with those out in the rest of the real world who are trying to accomplish something that cannot be done with what is currently available. And that absence may be just the idea of using one of your games or one of your technologies or one of your ideas. I've been using games for since 2008, but almost always as there's the fictional world of the game, and then hopefully something happens because someone got something. And it was through the Engagement Game Lab at Emerson that this idea dawned that games can be played by intervening in the real world, reading the real world, understanding it, modifying it, making something happen in the world as part of the gameplay experience. And this to me is a phenomenal idea that maybe could have been done before, but now with these little things that are completely prevalent in those places where you saw. I've been in Malawi. Life expectancy when I was there in that village was 39. So more than half of this room would be gone. But the cell phone is there. They don't have clinics, they don't have schools, but the cell phone is there. How can we help turn digital media into a space where solutions emerge from their own initiative?
So let me throw this general question out to the panel. How do you know that these interventions are working? And in particular, I'm actually curious about the preparation for learning and the differentiation between that and learning. And I don't want this to turn into, I really don't want this to turn into a conversation about evaluation, assessment, and debating about testing and whatnot. I just kind of want to hear almost like a common sense language. You know, when you've wrapped one of these projects after it's been deployed, like what is your gut sense of how do you know that it actually has succeeded? You know, whether you define it as preparation for learning or whether it's because now the finance minister is actually talking to the Red Cross or whatever. What is that outcome that you're really aiming for as the ultimate, extra loser or whatever outcome?
Well, I think with any any project, you need to go into it with very specific desired outcomes, and then be open in a kind of grounded theory approach to let things emerge, essentially. So we don't like to go into any game knowing exactly what we want the outcomes to be. This is why traditional evaluation doesn't quite work, because in fact, when things emerge, that's when you get the most exciting kind of outcomes. But in order to study it, in order to really understand, I do think it's really important that if a game is an answer to a particular question, you need to articulate the question, at least to start. And so we'll go in and say, well, can this game accomplish, can it increase trust? Can it increase lateral trust? Can it increase trust between citizens? Can it increase vertical trust? Do people have more trust in institutions, and are they more able to act, and actually does the game facilitate that action? So we'll go into a game with those questions prior. But then it's always the case that something happens through that act of play, when people give themselves permission to play, when people allow things to emerge from that process, that will come up with entirely new questions. And that goes back to this morning's keynote. It really is an important piece of design to then iterate, to go back around, to draw that kind of circular arrow back around. So I do think we need to distance ourselves from traditional evaluation in this work, but we cannot completely absolve ourselves of the responsibility of going in with measurable questions.
I would say the other thing is to really sort of ask yourself as compared to what. So, and I think too often people who try to make games for learning try to treat it as as a magic bullet, as sort of people are going to play the game and they're going to be transformed. That it's going to happen automatically. There's going to be no intent, there's going to be no agency, they're just going to play the game and they're going to be transformed. My assumption is that A, that you have to allow for the player's agency at every step of the way, and two is that you have to know what environment you're going into. So I wouldn't think about taking a game and plopping it in some alien environment and just having it work. I would rather say, what's happening now? What kind of, so to go back to the financial literacy thing, how are they being educated now? What kind of conversations do they have now? How do we intervene in that process? And then do we see improvement over that process? Which is better, does the lecturer have a different experience talking to the students after they played the game than before? Now that doesn't, I can't prove, that it's going to take us all the way to the goal line, but I can prove that we've improved the process so far. And as you say, it's iterative at that point. There's no, we don't solve all the flooding problems, but we've suddenly changed the behavior, and we keep at it. We keep seeing whether that works, and then so it's not one. Yeah. It's not one dose, and then you measure whether it worked or not.
A good example is one of the community planet games we did was in Detroit, and I remember a question I got in Detroit. We got about 1,000 players into this game and generated a significant amount of data that went into the Detroit Future City report. That was the 50-year planning document for the city. What was interesting about that is that at some point after the game had been played, I was asked, how many people play the game? Well, about 1,000. And 50% of those people were under 18. We got a significant amount of youth participating in a planning process. And really the question is, well, but there's 800,000 people in the city. How come you only got 1,000? And compared to your question, compared to what? Usually when you have a planning process, you get 10 people in a room, And so we're scaling up, we're changing the texture, even by having youth involved in a way that they couldn't be involved before, they wouldn't be involved before. We're changing the texture. But if the question is, well, if it's digital and if it's online, then it needs to, somehow we need to have 100% compliance in order for it to be a viable process. And I think that's a really important part of this, is to sort of manage expectations of the magic bullet.
Well, let me follow up on that, because I suspect that this is something many of you who are engaged in K-12 would encounter, right? I mean, a lot of us who are trying to be in the K-12 space cannot avoid the fact that the world today is dominated by assessments, testing, and test scores, and whether it's Common Core or otherwise. And so it seems inevitable that the question will eventually come, okay, that's all nice. How does this affect the test scores? And I'm curious, like I asked you the question before, what you think the outcomes are for success. Do you find that you're having an easy time of working with the people, your partners or clients, that they also have the same goals, or are they coming at it from almost the other direction and you're kind of redirecting them, almost kind of working across purposes? Where do you find that?
This has been a very pleasant surprise for me in the process of designing games with others, for others, that those others, be it the Zambia Red Cross or the UN team that distributes food aid or the chief economist or whoever, they think they have a problem that they haven't been able to solve well, and then they invite us to help create a game that addresses that problem. And in the process of game design, they reconfigure their own understanding, their own definition of what the problem is. And that is extremely valuable, because it reflects that in the process of game design, game prototyping and testing and so on, there's challenging assumptions that have been inside their brains for who knows how long. So there's something that happens in the safe space of game play as well as game design that opens something up. And I was just thinking about this definitional issue. I'd like to postulate another, cannot call it definition, but it's an attribute of games. Games are serendipity factories. When a game happens, stuff happens that would otherwise not have occurred, and it enables those around that table or that digital platform or that card exchange to see, check this out. Something rather unlikely has just manifested itself, and it may be revealing of a previously hidden truth or a previously hidden opportunity.
I like that definition. And just because I'm probably the one who works most in schools, and you asked specifically around that. If you came to me and said, I want to do a game that's going to improve kids' scores on standardized tests, we'd have a very difficult conversation. But if we're having a conversation about kids' education and kids' learning, we can talk about the environment in which there happen to be standardized tests. I mean, we don't have to ignore them, but I don't think like I said, a game is not this dosage that produces an automatic result. I think when you get under the surface, you find most teachers have a more nuanced understanding of learning than standardized test scores. And most of them want to work in that space that's more interesting. There's plenty of research that shows that on sort of the relatively standard measures of learning, that game-like learning can work. I mean, there's a growing body of evidence. I'm hoping we're going to be adding to that body of evidence. But as I said, you can only have that if you're having a productive conversation about learning in general, not just about schools as an institution that produce test scores.
Well, I suppose it's about how you understand the problem to be solved. So,
Right.
what you're saying is that these large agencies have units within them who have intractable problems, and they come to you and they say, "I've got this problem, I need it solved." And the games that you design are very good at solving that. I think in the case of teachers, often it's the problem is, maybe the problem is test scores. Maybe
Right.
the problem is and if that's the problem, then the solution that gets designed is not necessarily the game that you want to make. And so I guess the issue is then, can games actually reframe the problem instead of just arriving at solutions more efficiently?
So let me toss that back to you, because I kind of want to revisit the title of this session, which is, and specifically I want to talk about the term real-world impact, right? And I think the panel this morning about youth and games and civic engagement, one of the participants had said, the goal isn't to just create that photo op at the end, where you could just pretend that you had civic engagement and then this is what people think of as civic engagement. I think there's also this feeling of, well, we can, what is real-world impact? To be very honest, Pablo, I don't tend to, I think a lot of people don't think like, get the finance minister to talk to another organization as real-world impact. You tend to want the photogenic, the photos that you actually had. Not that you didn't have photos of the finance ministers talking. You had
I
photos.
can show you one if you want.
Well, right, but you had photos of villagers who are suddenly like doing things differently, right? So, but if you think about it, I imagine that getting the finance minister to think differently about an issue would actually have significantly more world impact than a lot of things that you could do. So. I just want to put this out as an open question. Well, what do you think of as being real-world impact of a game?
Yeah, if any of you is involved in a conventional evaluation of learning, and you want to try something with a group that maybe you haven't tried before, humanitarian workers, subsistence farmers, and so on, let's talk. I crave for that, and we don't have the brain power or the money to do it. So the conventional metrics of impact, I think, are worth sharing if they happen. Yeah. But to me, what is most illuminating about this real-world impact is when you see in a room, I see it most often through games. It can happen with other ways, like hearing the keynote speech this morning. When you see in someone's face that abrupt, sudden realization of something clicking, and there's even the observable, I don't know if measurable, but observable joy of discovery. Something brightens up, something expands, something becomes luminous. And that, I would call that an impact, because that can become transformative for the person who undergoes that. Be it a cognitive obstacle, like what does climate change mean for fishing in Vanuatu, or about figure out that here's someone who can be your partner, and then you can have that conversation. Just this morning, I already have 3 new potential partners to do stuff, and if someone took the photo and had a joy of discovery meter, I would be off the charts, because it's so palpable, and I know that that will have impact, that we will do more with what we have because of that.
I also think the question of sort of what you're measuring is so important, because for me, one of the biggest successes I feel from a game is when I hear from a teacher, and this happens happily often, I'm seeing great performance from kids I wasn't expecting it from.
Right.
Now it isn't just to me, the issue isn't that for that kid, I mean, I assume those kids actually have tremendous capabilities. that school just isn't harnessing. But when you change the teacher, when you actually change the teacher's understanding of the way their kids learn, that's not going to show up on the test scores. But that seems to me, so it seems to me that it is something much more systemic than just do we get the results that we said we wanted to.
I mean, the kinds of things you're saying is interesting because when I'm hearing what you're saying, it actually sounds a lot like when you talk to artists about what their real-world impact is. It's different than, for example, when you talk to, a curriculum developer in some ways, right? So I just find that interesting. I don't know what to do with that observation, but it just sounds like it's a different place in terms of the kinds of outcomes you're looking for.
I wonder whether we shouldn't be getting
That's
audience's
right.
response to that.
That is a very good point.
Yeah.
We are running out of time here. Yeah, so that's so you can either respond to that question
let's
or
there.
open it up and throw out your own questions. Why don't we start right over there?
In thinking about this idea of real world impact, I guess, of games, my question goes to everyone. Has there ever been an experience where in designing games that, visiting communities and designing games that in some way want to empower them to kind of affect change in real world situations that really could be life or death? Have you ever experienced any like aversion to someone coming in and kind of being like, you're making a game of this real life thing? And while I recognize that games can be very empowering in that space, but I'm wondering if you've ever experienced any obstacles or folks being like, well, this is not a game. And if so, what techniques have you used to perhaps maybe circumvent that or really bring communities in to really see the value of the game?
I'll take a first stab at that. Yes. I'm done. No. No, it happens all the time. And in fact, I think that this question of the authenticity and the legitimacy of play is really what it comes to. And I think one of the design principles that we use in the design of many of our games is a kind of intergenerational component, that when games are only for kids, then play becomes only for kids. And the outcomes of that play then are delegitimized in the eyes of adults because it's simply play. And so I'm really interested in that intergenerational piece because what it does, and we've done some research about this specifically, but what it does is that it generates a kind of authenticity going both ways. So the youth often see it as authentic, but with the presence of adults within an online system lends a sense of legitimacy to the process for those youth. And likewise, the sense of presence of the youth for the adults lends a sense of hope, actually, as it turns out. And so what's interesting is that when you have those two pieces together, you're actually deflating some of those criticisms of it being only play. So that's one answer. And then the other answer is in dealing with governments and organizations that I deal with a lot. There's often a resistance to that. There's often a resistance to, there's two things. One, on one hand, there's a game, it's so innovative, let's do it, and maybe a misunderstanding of what the actual goals of that is, or rather particular understandings that don't necessarily align with mine. And then on the other hand, there's that disbelief or that mistrust that somehow a game can be fun and not frivolous, and that we're going to delegitimize a process by making it a game. And I actually think that's a fundamental challenge, and it was what I was trying to get at in my earlier comments, is that when we give ourselves to permission to play within this magic circle, are we saying that those actions that are taken within play are not as real or as important as actions that we can take outside of that realm of play? And sure, it's safe because when we play, we can fail and it's safe. But at the same time, what I'm really interested in is sort of moving the meter a little bit so that those acts of play can generate a new form of legitimacy, essentially. That in fact people say like, oh yeah, people are playing, and in fact we're getting better answers. Because people are doing it within the context of play.
Actually, Pablo, can you quickly speak to this? Because I know you are constantly working with very high-level people.
So we can have a very long conversation. It's very, very important. We take that very seriously. We were once in a classroom setting with a prototype playful activity that involved, if it goes wrong, someone dies, and something went wrong, and in the fiction of the game, someone died, and someone in the room started crying inconsolably and left the room because it really reminded them of something that happened to them in the real world. It's a very simple way to learn to take the fiction of the game very seriously. So now we are extremely cautious when going anywhere, starting by saying this is not the real world, this is a playful endeavor. If anyone doesn't feel comfortable, you're most welcome to leave and help us do this better, etc., as participatory as we can. An anecdote worth sharing in the case of Matu, Kenya, that you saw a few seconds of a clip, 98% of the land owned by men. Smart women don't own land, live in possibly poor conditions. And in the fiction of the game was designed to show that if your initial conditions are such that there's no way you can make it, whether you're male or female, under those rules, you can't make it. And it led to the awareness that was already there for most, but not for all, that, if we change the rules, it'll be better for, say, a single mother with 6 children. Now, there was a moment when there was the temptation by the visitors, the Mzungus, those of us with white skin, to try to elicit a revolution of the ladies to equalize and take power. Well, guess what? We're not going to be there when then everything goes back to normal, right? So if everything goes back to normal and there can be domestic violence or any other manifestation of what we don't want to create an excessively safe space in the fiction of the game that then gets whacked by reality. So it's something that has to be taken very seriously. As far as I know, we take very seriously, and before deploying a game, we work very closely with those who are familiar with the local circumstance. I'm sure we've trespassed, and I apologize publicly for every single time that happened. But in our experience and in the experience of those we relate to, it's worth it. It's worth trying as long as you take seriously what can go wrong.
Right, just so I want you to know, there's about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to try to move a little bit more quickly through the questions over there.
Could any of you elaborate more or make more explicit the tension between using games to instigate individual behavioral change versus changing institutional cultures? Because I see this list of organizations, and a lot of them do bad things. And yet most of the examples put the impetus for change on the communities. So the example of the payday loan game, don't use payday loan, don't use credit cards. Well, how does that then transform into shut those things down through gaming?
Both are important, and the same foundation that funds that work does other work sort of in the public sphere to try to change policy on that front. But let me shift it to schooling, for example. There's a lot of problems with the education system that I sometimes wish we could just blow it up and start all over again. But then I keep reminding myself every year there's millions of kids graduating in the system, and so working with the kids who are there now is also important. So I think in that example you gave, yes, it's important to change the system, but there are also people every day who are getting sucked into bad deals, and it's worth trying to speak to them too. It doesn't mean that they're morally responsible for that. I'm not suggesting that the people who take out bad loans are morally responsible for their entrapment. They're not. All the more reason to protect, because society is at large sometimes holds people accountable for those decisions, all the more reason to help them avoid those decisions, not because we share that sensibility. I think there would be different games for different so a game that was meant to inspire political action would be planned for a different venue, would be a different game than a game that was meant to be about individual responsibility. Both of them have their place.
Most of our games are involve individual decisions that have individual and collective consequences, and as part of gameplay, people realize both what they can do in that system and how the system could be changed. So that's actually, you have Ian Bogost quote, I forgot, it's something about creating a form of literacy, procedural literacy or something like that, where games can help figure out that a system is a system and has its rules, and if you want something to change, you may need to change those rules, and it may be worth it, and it may be changeable.
And just quickly to respond to that, one of the things that we look at and actually try to measure in some way is collective efficacy. But I would say that there definitely is a kind of liberal, not radical bent to many of our projects, because we're trying to create efficacy essentially within systems as opposed to trying to operate outside of them. And I think that's just with our games, allowing people to collectively assemble to get something done through the game, even in cooperation with government, is something that we see of value. So while we're not necessarily radically transforming systems that are instilled with problematic sort of power elements, we are actually empowering people to work within those systems in ways that I think are valuable.
Over here.
Question about the most memorable mistake each of the three of you mentioned. Pablo, you kind of brought it into relief because it's really about evaluating games on your own terms, not on the terms of whether or not the goals conform with some external assessment, but I think it's a very good way to understand how games work by looking at the most memorable mistake, and that was actually very compelling. I don't know if that would be your number one choice, but I would be very curious to hear all three of you sort of mention the number one mistake or something that happened that forced a rethink for subsequent, that you kind of carried with you in subsequent design.
The one I shared was probably the deepest, not the most memorable. It's too long to explain, but basically there was a game that was designed to show a solution, and in deploying the game, we were all smacked in the face by the abrupt revelation that that was a solution to a non-problem. The problem was something else. And surprisingly, teams that have been working on this issue for decades, only through the game were slapped in the face by the community saying, that's not my problem, it's yours, apparently.
I have an example from actually a project I did with Gene many, many years ago called Hub 2. And this is a project we did in Second Life that was sort of game-like. But I remember it included a facilitation of these essentially workshops with people in Second Life at the same time that they were in physical space discussing a planned development. And there were a bunch of youth in the room doing this process. And at some point, I completely it was definitely a facilitation foul in that someone did something within the virtual space, and I said, oh, that's really interesting. Who did that? And I violated this sort of rule of anonymity within that space because people were actually doing really interesting things within this virtual space, and that was part of the affordance, the benefit of actually having them in that virtual space while also in the physical space, that it changed the nature of dialogue, that they could do things with their avatars in that virtual space that wasn't attached to their identity. And I called this kid out, and it was probably the longest 3 seconds of my life. Is this kid sort of said, that was me, it's really awful. But that was a great learning experience to just to think about how within these moments of play, how identity is really an important thing either to protect or not, and depending on the player.
So mine would probably be a game we did a long time ago that was really good, and a good, interesting way into thinking about computer programming. Really good, tough, interesting puzzles, but we didn't figure out how to frame it in an imaginative enough way that people who weren't immediately challenged by the puzzles wanted to take it on. So in other words, we got a much smaller slice of players than we would have, because it's the point that I alluded to in my last slide about this sort of imaginative space, about the invitation for people to live imaginatively in the world of the game. I think even though it had nothing to do with the rules of the game or the structure of the game, I think it had everything to do with people's engagement. So. Yep.
Hi. It's interesting. I come from the arts world, so I see a lot of correlations around engagement and intention and invitation. And my question related to that is around reflective practice and how much intention you give to the kind of wrap around the game that allows for the reflective practice. Like I noticed, I imagined we just were short on time, that with the hurricane game, the discussion that ensues after is as important to design and think about as is the game. And I wondered how you attend to the reflective practice around games.
What we're trying to do with our games, almost always someone before you took more time, and then you have less time, and then you cannot budget the time for the debriefing and the reflection that deserves to be there. So to the extent possible, and I deliberately didn't do it today because I wanted to show 7 minutes, and if I had built reflection in 7 minutes, just starting to speak doesn't work. But we try to build a reflection within gameplay, as opposed to first you play and then you reflect. In part because after the end of gameplay, energy can go down, and so, oh, now we have to draw lessons. You want to avoid that. But also because it's much richer to say, if you have 10 rounds of a game, and at the end there's winners and losers, and you stop at round 8, and invite a conversation, why do you think things are going the way they are? How can you explain patterns and so on? That's a richer part. Usually we never get enough time for reflection, period. In life, in family life, in work life, or in games. But we wish we all had more.
When we're talking about academic stuff, I always presume that the real learning happens in the reflection, not in, I mean, yes, something real is happening in the gameplay, but it doesn't solidify. I mean, I'd argue that maybe 10% of the kids playing my games walk away naturally making the connection, but the other 90% are available. And so so the how varies tremendously based on the nature of the game and where it's going to be, but we always think about how is the reflection going to happen. We never design a game without thinking about that. That's a short answer.
Am I right? And that's what Jim G calls the capital G game around the game?
Yeah. I mean, one method is to actually have people teamed up and having needs to share strategy with each other is one way to do it. Another way is to give teachers easy hooks to how they can use the game in their lessons after the fact. But there are other ways.
And I would say almost inherent in games is a kind of reflection because you try something out in a game, it doesn't work, you reflect and you do it again. And so it's one of the, I think it's one of the sort of basic affordances of games. Now whether or not they get at that that sort of extra illusory thing, and whether or not you need that kind of debriefing. And traditionally, debriefing was the time when you did all of that, and that's. There's a lot of literature that looks at debriefing as the moment that the metagame comes into play and like all those learning outcomes play out. And I'll just say very briefly that this is something that is really close to my heart. And some of we just published an article called Playful Civic Learning, wherein we define the idea of civic learning as specifically reflective action taking. And that kind of civic learning can actually happen in games because of the system of the game and not only in the moment of reflection.
We started 5 minutes late, so I'll squeeze in one last question over here.
Thanks. My name's Kevin Adler. My work as a sociologist and an entrepreneur has focused on how disasters and shared traumas can influence social capital. And I've seen a lot of communities where God or having an us versus them mentality is a pretty good fall guy for the community to rally together. What is the role that you found in presenting an adversary into games? Is it important? Is there more of a cooperative spirit to a lot of the games? And how is that navigated by some of the participants?
We tend to portray the adversary as the negative outcome itself. So hungry people, homeless, disease outbreaks, those are the negative outcomes. Very often we interact with individuals, communities, organizations who assign blame and culpability either on some divine entity that got furious or on extreme bad luck. And usually if God punished you or Allah or some other divine entity, you didn't behave that badly, it shouldn't happen again. And if it was extremely bad luck, well, extremely bad luck rarely happens, it really shouldn't happen again. As a result, people conclude, I can continue doing the same thing and it won't go wrong. By portraying the outcome as the consequence of input factors that are changing, be it in terms of people's interactions or in terms of changing rainfall patterns, games tend to reveal that the outcome is now more likely. The outcome you don't like is more likely because there's, deforestation upstream causing flood, or changing politics, creating more volatility on the price of food, whatever may be the case. So we prefer to stay away from a monster that sends you evil things just because of the nature of our work. But that's usually the default mindset of not just subsistence farmers, but also government officials in many wealthy nations.
I mean, from a design point of view, so we have dice. I'm just thinking of the dice because they're sitting there on the floor. if we played a game in which we're rolling the dice and if it's odd, I win, and if it's even, you win, now we're adversaries. But if we had a game in which we both are going to win or lose based on the system of the dice, then the dice is the adversary. That's okay. In other words, the system is the problem, not the other people in the game. So, you know, you can design games with where people are winners or losers, or you can design games where collectively you're playing against the system.
Thank you all for being here, this elite group, filling up this large space with your energy. I can't speak for everyone, but I'll be around, and I think a lot of you will be around. We have about 20 minutes till the next session begins in here. So again, thank you all for coming, and enjoy the rest of the conference.